So before we begin, we do a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge and remind ourselves that we are hosting this event from the traditional and treaty territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, the Six Nations of the Grand, and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. We remember that before Confederation, many peoples lived on and shared these lands, including the Neutral Confederacy and a host of other Indigenous peoples, some known and some whose presence is only attested to by the archaeological record. We acknowledge the trauma of the colonial experience that followed the arrival of settlers to these lands and the burden which that trauma imposes on us as heritage professionals to decolonize our profession. It's easy for land acknowledgements like these to become empty and reflexive, almost like saying bless you after someone sneezes. But as heritage professionals, it's always worth contemplating that the 2 centuries that we settlers have been living in this part of Canada pale in comparison to the 12,000 years that the First Nations were here before us. Indeed, the fact that we focus so much of our energies on those last 2 centuries is something that just maybe should make us a little uncomfortable. I'd like to tell you that every year, ARA Limited selects a worthy charity or initiative, usually Indigenous focused, to support using donations from CHAP attendees. And I should add that we never use these contributions to finance the event itself. We're not a not-for-profit, and this symposium is, for us, a valuable way of connecting with our colleagues and clients in heritage and archaeology. So this year for our charity, we have selected the Moccasin Identifier, a project developed by our friend Carolyn King, who's been with us since the beginning in these symposia, and newly appointed member of the Order of Canada to promote public awareness of significant cultural historic sites and the ancestral presence of First Nations, Métis, and Indigenous communities. The Moccasin Identifier project has created grade-specific educational kits that can be used by schools to teach children about the history of the land that they're learning on and its connection to the Indigenous peoples who live there still. For the most visual and compelling part of the curriculum, children use stencils depicting a moccasin of whichever First Nations are connected to the land that they're on, whether Anishinaabe, Cree, Haudenosaunee, or Wendat. The project has drawn a good deal of media attention and attracted some wonderful partners, including the Bata Shoe Museum and the Green Belt. And in Canada, you know you've made it when you receive the Ron MacLean Seal of Approval. Anyway, we'd like to thank you for your generous support for this project. Educating the public about the Indigenous presence on the cultural heritage landscape is very on brand for the heritage community and goes some way towards achieving call to action number 62 of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which asks that governments and educators work with Indigenous communities to create curricula to educate K-12 students about the historical and contemporary contributions of Indigenous peoples to Canada. So again, thank you. You not only talk the talk, but you walk the walk. Now, there's none of you who are here to listen to me, and I have a hard time thinking of a symposium I've attended where I can even remember who emceed it, perhaps with the exception of times where things went horribly wrong, which when I think about it doesn't reflect well on me. So I'm going to be brief, but I wanted to touch on the subject of Indigenous cultural heritage landscapes because I don't think we've done a very good job of identifying them and protecting them. I think it's fair to say that in heritage circles, we tend to think of Indigenous cultural heritage landscapes as more ephemeral than settler ones, as being more subtle and harder to detect without resorting to oral traditions. Many of us, myself included, have a rather romantic notion that Indigenous peoples live light on the land and that their lifestyles were so sustainable that it can almost be impossible to find traces of them. And there's some truth to that, as you'll hear from Dr. Gary Warwick later today. If we settlers lived in a place for 12,000 years, it would be full of our garbage. And Canada is clearly not like that. But at the macroscopic level, what we're finding out more and more is that we are living in an Indigenous cultural heritage landscape. And furthermore, with a 500-year-long tradition of devaluing Indigenous cultures, maybe we've not allowed ourselves to see it. It's easy for us to forget, for instance, that many of the oldest and most historically significant roads in Ontario follow alignments that were used for hundreds or even thousands of years by Indigenous traders and travelers long before settlers got here. Yonge Street, Dundas Street, Kingston Road, all of these were built on existing Indigenous trails. And those trails established the framework for both where the settlers lived and how they moved around between those places in modern times. And it's a pattern that persists to this day. We also forget things like, for instance, that Fort Toronto was constructed to trade with the First Nations coming down the Humber River along the Carrying Place Trail, or that Brantford was quite literally once Brant's Ford, referring to Indigenous leader Joseph Brant. Archaeologists are discovering more and more that Ontario wasn't some trackless wilderness prior to the arrival of European settlers. In fact, it's becoming increasingly clear that virtually the whole of southern Ontario was a managed landscape. It was inhabited by some 70,000 or more longhouse peoples and thousands more hunting, gathering, and gardening peoples, all of whom actively transformed the landscape in ways that still reverberate to this day. We've ignored the earliest European accounts of abundant fields that covered the countryside and their use of fire to encourage renewal in the landscape. Indeed, several archaeologists, Gary Warwick included, I should say, have suggested that this place was comparable to a medieval landscape with well-groomed trails and large fields of crops scattered across a landscape dotted with towns, villages, and hamlets. The country may have seemed sparsely populated in the early 1800s when European settlement took off here, but that was only because our arrival in the so-called New World was so apocalyptic for the Indigenous peoples who were here first. Between the diseases we introduced and the beaver wars that the fur trade sparked, the First Nations saw their numbers plummet drastically. Without baseline data, we'll never know by how much, but population declines by as much as 95% have been suggested. Whatever the figure, climate scientists now believe that the effect of that depopulation and the reversion of so much land to forest cover may have actually impacted the Earth's climate, causing a steep drop in atmospheric carbon that either triggered or exacerbated a period of cold known as the Little Ice Age, in which global temperatures, particularly in Europe, ironically, dropped, and millions died from the resulting cold, famine, and poverty. If this hypothesis is proven true, it would suggest a strange and accidental sort of karma was at play. Anyway, as I said earlier, you're not here to listen to me ramble, and we have some excellent speakers on hand this afternoon. We're a 100% virtual event this year, but we've structured the presentation so that questions can still be asked along the way. If you have any questions for speakers or panelists, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom window. If you don't see it, hover your mouse over the bottom of the Zoom screen. And type your questions in there, and we'll have the speakers answer them once they finish their presentations. If you're having technical difficulties, you can email Stephanie McLeod at this address here, or use the chat button in the Zoom application, and we'll get to you as soon as we can. Our schedule for the first day looks like this. We're hoping to avoid any technical difficulties, but we ask you to bear with us should they occur. We're all in different locations with different internet providers and kids and dogs and every manner of distraction you can imagine. When it happens, and I expect it will at some point, I hope we can just enjoy it together. Now on to our presenters. We begin with Dr. David Galbraith, Head of Science at the Royal Botanical Gardens. David did his bachelor's and Master of Science degrees in wildlife biology at Guelph University and a PhD in wildlife. Sorry, I was reading that from the screen and I've just lost it. But anyway, and a PhD from Queen's University. So I am pleased to introduce to you Mr. David, or Dr. David Galbraith, sorry. And I look forward to his presentation. Thank you. Go ahead, David.
Well, thank you, Paul. And I apologize. I may have caused your technical discontinuity there for a moment as I was bringing up my title slide.
That's okay.
Well, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me in, Paul and company. Having just experienced that wonderful introduction to this symposium, my remarks will be entirely settler culture based, but that's part of the landscape that we're dealing with as well. So let me just make sure everything's working. Okay. This presentation was originally planned as an on-the-ground tour of part of Royal Botanical Gardens for the Cultural Heritage, Archaeology and Planning Symposium in 2020. But that event was, of course, curtailed because of the emergence of the COVID-19 pandemic situation. So as a poor substitute, I've got a few minutes to introduce the idea of cultural heritage landscapes through the particular lens of public gardens. And this is, again, a different kind of lens than Paul's introduction about thinking about cultural heritage landscapes in the perspective of indigenous communities and the very long history of occupation of Southern Ontario. I'm always grateful for Paul's remarks about the perspective of what people were doing here before the arrival of European settlers. We're only just beginning, I think, to understand that. And I will make a few remarks about this as we go. But we're primarily talking here about historical and European influences on the land. So I'll talk about public gardens briefly and some examples, and then we'll take a look at this one particular area, Hendry Park at RBG, as a case study. As Paul introduced, I'm also grateful for the long history of First Nations and Métis people in the province of Ontario, and I pay respects to the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, the treaty and rights holder for the lands stewarded by Royal Botanical Gardens. I'm speaking to you from within the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat nations. And it's certainly important that these sorts of statements be the beginning of dialogues, not a perfunctory statement that one makes and then moves past. In the case of Royal Botanical Gardens, although again, it's not the topic of this presentation, we are very happy to be working with Indigenous communities on projects over the past few years. We have very important archaeological sites here as well. We're always trying to expand our understanding and awareness and seek reciprocity and respectful relations. I also have to thank the many RBG volunteers and staff and the numerous colleagues interested in cultural heritage, landscape, and history that I've been working with over the years who have greatly influenced and increased my awareness. We are children of our landscape. It dictates behavior and even thought in the measure to which we are responsive to it. I don't view landscape as simply a gigantic artifact. I think that it's in fact an intrinsic part of our lives. It's an intrinsic part of the lives of the people who have come before us, and it's an intrinsic part of the lives of our descendants and the descendants of those around us. And if we respect the land and the organisms and people that live on it, I think we'll be doing a much better job for the future. We still have a long way to go. Now, cultural heritage landscapes are probably fairly well known to you in the audience. It's generally thought of as a defined geographical area that may have been modified by human activity and is identified as having cultural heritage value or interest to a community, including an Aboriginal community. The area may involve features such as structures, spaces, archaeological sites, or natural elements that are valued together for their interrelationship, meaning, or association. Examples may include, but are not limited to, heritage conservation districts designated under the Ontario Heritage Act, villages, parks, gardens, battlefields, main streets and neighborhoods, cemeteries, trailways, view sheds, natural areas, and industrial complexes of heritage significance, and areas recognized by federal or international designation authorities, such as a National Historic Site or designation of a district, or a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Gardens are not necessarily the first thing that people turn to when they start thinking about heritage, but there are certainly areas in Ontario where gardens have been formally designated as heritage landscapes, including Corby Park Gardens in Bellevue, the Allen Gardens in Toronto, which is now prominently a conservatory, but historically was a botanical garden. Rockway Gardens in Kitchener is a fine example of this, although it's a roadside area now that people pass by quickly. Its development in the early 20th century was a prime example of the work of local horticultural and civic improvement societies and their effect on bringing gardening to the people. Another example is the Templin Gardens in Fergus. Now, World Heritage categories under UNESCO for cultural landscapes include things like designed landscapes. These include gardens or parklands designed for aesthetic, religious, or other purposes. Organically evolved landscapes, which include communities and farms and other areas shaped over time by human activities, often with interactions with natural systems. And associative cultural landscapes as well. These include areas associated with historic, religious, or other events or figures, whether or not material evidence is present at this time. And at the lofty global level of things like UNESCO World Heritage Sites, there certainly are some prominent gardens which are considered of World Heritage significance. Royal Botanic Gardens Kew, for example, is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, as is the Orto Botanico in Padua, Italy, the botanical garden from the 1500s that was one of the earliest that still survives. Other European examples include gardens and castle at Komeritz in Czechia, the Palace and Park of Versailles in France, and the Garden Kingdom of Dessau-Wörlitz in Germany. These are all large, planned, built landscapes that have had significant cultural associations. Now, thinking about public gardens, the public garden has a variety of definitions. The American Public Gardens Association describes them as an institution that maintains collections of plants for the purposes of public education and enjoyment, in addition to research, conservation, and higher learning. It must be open to the public, and the garden's resources and accommodations must be made to all visitors. Public gardens are staffed by professionals trained in their given areas of expertise and maintain active plant record systems. That's actually a very broad category, and organizations and institutions that self-select to become members of that association, which includes over 600 members at the present time across North America primarily, include botanical gardens and arboreta, zoological parks, sculpture gardens, college and university campuses, historic homes and cemeteries. Urban greening organizations are involved in some places, as are protected natural areas, and city, municipal, provincial, or even national parks. That definition is also very similar to one that's used commonly for what a botanical garden is itself. Botanic or botanical gardens are those institutions holding documented collections of living plants for the purposes of scientific research, conservation, display, and education. All these definitions revolve fundamentally around the role of plants in the landscape and the connection between people, plants, and important social themes like education and well-being. We have several botanical gardens and related agencies in Canada which are designated already as National Historic Sites, including Montreal Botanical Garden, or Le Jardin Botanique de Montréal, the Reeford Gardens, or Jardin de Métis in Mont-Joli, Quebec, Halifax Public Gardens in Nova Scotia, the Central Experimental Farm in Ottawa, which includes an arboretum and a botanical garden on site, the Bouchard Gardens in Victoria, British Columbia, George Pegg Homestead and Botanic Garden outside of Glen Nevis, Alberta, and Royal Botanical Gardens itself. At this time, Royal Botanical Gardens has two heritage designations. One is that designation as a National Historic Site of Canada, which was granted in 1993. And the other is a hyper-local municipal heritage designation of a site called the Hendry Gates in Hendry Park, which I'll describe in a moment. I say it's hyperlocal because the heritage area designated by the bylaw from 1991 is only a few meters in all directions around the actual structure of these gates themselves. In the description of the character defining elements in the RBG National Historic Site of Canada, Hendry Park, which is the case I'm going to lay out here, is absolutely included as one of the big components of Royal Botanical Gardens. And cited in the character defining elements are things like its design, the geometric layout along a principal axis. It includes major gardens within itself, a rose garden, a medicinal plants garden, and others. Structures such as a fountain courtyard and a tea house, and plant collections. Again, a principal way of understanding whether something is a botanical garden is to ask questions about whether it has actual collections of plants. For those who may not be familiar with RBG, we are a large set of properties that covers approximately 1,100 hectares in the cities of Hamilton and Burlington. The majority of that landscape is designated as nature sanctuary and includes wetlands, terrestrial habitats, and parts of the Niagara Escarpment. Hendry Park is one component of Royal Botanical Gardens at its easternmost extent, entirely within the city of Burlington, and on this graphic, it's the area that's yellow. The brighter yellow at the bottom is the garden area. The larger area is a nature sanctuary, which is also identified as Hendry Park. Hendry Park was in part a former farm, which I'll describe briefly as well. And it was the natural aspect of this property which brought it to the attention of the city of Hamilton in the 1920s for protection as parkland. On its southern extent is a set of gardens, which is really the focus of this presentation along Plains Road West in Burlington. These are the gardens at Hendry Park. But all of this green space, including the prominent wetland in the middle, is the lower Grindstone Creek Ravine coming out of Burlington and heading towards Hamilton Harbor. And with the exception of the subdivisions to the north and south, this is all Royal Botanical Gardens nature sanctuary property. It is a beautiful area. It's very important for natural biological diversity. And while it has not been extensively explored yet from an archaeological perspective, we suspect that there are archaeological sites in the ravine as well. Some of our staff have found places, for example, where concentrations of flint chips are eroding out of banks. It's a favorite area for our members and for visitors. It's just a few hundred meters away from Highway 403, and yet it is a protected nature sanctuary. It has a lot of attributes as a public park that contribute to understanding it as a cultural heritage landscape as well. It has associations with William Hendry and his family, and I'll describe those very briefly in a moment. It's also tied into the history of C.V. Langs and Thomas Baker McQuestion and their efforts in the early 20th century to build public parks and gardens in Hamilton especially, but larger in the province of Ontario as well. The gardens date from the 1960s and were created by a prominent Toronto-based landscape architect named J. Austin Floyd, who is remembered primarily for a modern style of garden design, although these gardens have a more classical aspect given their symmetrical layout. It certainly is considered a landmark in our area, and as part of a National Historic Site of Canada, it is certainly worth consideration as a cultural heritage landscape. An important aspect of a garden area like this is that it's not a historical garden or a heritage garden. It's not managed to keep its appearance or features at some point that might represent a past state. It is an actively managed public garden. Horticultural practices and even collections and garden design change over time. We can get an idea of how complicated the landscape is by taking a look at a Google Earth screen cap. This is the most recent one that's on Google Earth for our area that's of good resolution from 3 years back in 2018. And I'll talk a little bit more about the changes over time in the space. But to give you an idea of the management units that you see here, There actually are over a dozen different gardens managed to different purposes within this particular space. There's a very large rose garden. There is a garden that highlights culinary plants. There's a garden that demonstrates backyard gardening. There is a natural or native plants of Ontario garden, and there were various commemorative sites as well, including those Hendry gates, which are off of the main axis in this little yellow area here. So it's a complicated, dense space, which is one of the main visitor experiences when people come to RBG. In the settler history era, it was largely farmland in the later 19th century. William Hendry was a Scottish immigrant who came to North America in the 1850s and brought with him a real entrepreneurial, inventive aspect. He became someone pivotal in the history of railroads in Canada. Although the one big monument today to him is this Hendry Valley Farm area, the Hendry Park today. And it was an area which he used for raising draft horses and other animals, and later racehorses. The draft horses were crucial for his cartage business, but he just absolutely adored farm animals and became an early proponent of horse racing in Ontario and a founder of the Jockey Club. After he died in 1906, the family continued to own the farm property for a while, but in the 1920s sold off the tableland for development and housing, and then around 1924 entered into agreements with the city of Hamilton to transfer the property to the city as a park. That was finally achieved in 1931 with William's final surviving son, George, transferring 122 acres of ravine land to the city. We're just learning more about William. In fact, his family have just published a biography from which I've snapped those pictures on this slide. It's a great painting of William from 3 years before he passed away. Apparently, he was wearing a suit made from wool that was cultivated on the sheep of his farm in Burlington. And he was a big proponent of horse-drawn transportation. He used Shire horses in his cartage company. What he did was to invent a lading bill, a bill of lading system for moving cargo to and from railroad stations. Prior to this, in the 1850s, it was kind of a free-for-all to get cargo to and from train stations. The trains were transforming the landscape and operations in the province of Ontario, but people would just show up at the train station or hire someone to take their cargo to the trains for transport. Hendry came up with a standardized bill of lading and ended up with a monopoly on moving cargo to and from the train stations throughout Ontario and up in Quebec, into Quebec and down into the States. It really was an information revolution at the time. The park itself is dedicated to the memory both of William and also 4 of his sons who passed away before the park was dedicated. This family was prominent in the province at the time, including a mayor of Hamilton and I believe a lieutenant governor of Ontario at one point as well. But this is one of the monuments within Hendry Park dedicated to the family, a plaque that was actually prepared for presentation in 1953. Now, when the park was acquired by the city of Hamilton as a public park for the people of Hamilton, the concept of how to use it as a landscape was very different from what we see today. Carl Borgstrom was RBG's designated landscape designer and master planner, and Humphrey Carver was one of his colleagues. And in the late 30s, they came up with one of several maps of Hendry Park, suggesting things like building roads throughout the park down in the ravine area with parking areas so that people could drive in and get out of their car and enjoy the spaces and then drive back out again. This design fortunately didn't happen for all kinds of reasons. But what we see when we look at drawings like this is the realization that the actual use of the landscape was highly contingent on a variety of decisions. It evolved over time. One of the biggest changes happened around 1950 or 1952. Prior to that, Royal Botanical Gardens headquarters was going to be down beside McMaster University in Hamilton. RBG was operating out of a couple of older buildings at this point, and they wanted a large headquarters. But there was also a concern that any sort of institutional presence in the Westdale area of Hamilton would be overshadowed by the growing McMaster University campus. And so the decision was taken to move the planned headquarters building to Hendry Park, over in what is now the city of Burlington in Aldershot, and abandon the idea of building a headquarters building beside McMaster University. The gates, which have a heritage designation, are considered among the best examples of wrought iron work ever done. They were created by an artisan and a journalist and activist named Frederick Flatman, and were completed around 1931. He was working for the Hendry Cartage Company as an artisan blacksmith. And they were intended as a ceremonial gate structure to the Hendry Park. But there was a disagreement as to what to do with them, and no money, basically, to build the entrance to the park. So they were put into storage for 10 years at the company's expense, and then moved in 1943 to a barn owned by Royal Botanical Gardens, where they lay on their side for another 10 years until they were finally erected in 1953 at their present location. Around that location was the first evidence of gardens at Hendry Park. There were several structures and garden areas built out there, one of them being what is now called the Scented Garden. And this is a great example of how dynamically programmed the garden is for the presentation of plant material. The Scented Garden might look like this in one year, and it might look like this the next. It's actively programmed to provide an interesting destination for our visitors and an interesting sensory experience as well. The gardens themselves were constructed in the early 1960s. The pathways and the individual garden areas are those little rooms. And there was a formal kickoff in 1967 when the Rose Garden, the semicircular area at the northern end of the gardens, was completed. This was labeled as a centennial project, and the garden had the Centennial Rose Garden name for many years. Development continued over time. Additional garden areas were laid out. This is looking south from the mid-1970s. The Hendry Gates are over here on the east side of the property. That little commemoration space is in here. And RBG Center, which was eventually opened in 1958 as the headquarters, the core of what we have now as RBG Center is here on the south side of Plains Road West. So the building went up, it was designed, and then J. Austin Floyd fitted the garden design into the landscape around the road and an access through the pre-existing building. Even the entranceway into the garden, the Oak Allée, is an actively programmed space. Our horticultural people design different garden treatments every year. It's a way of bringing people into the space and providing them with display. Even things as important as plant collections, though, can move around. For example, the Hemerocalis or daylily collection at RBG was moved to Hendry Park in the 1980s from the Spring Garden, which was being renamed the Laking Garden. And these are always managed for particular purposes. They are not themselves in immovable historical artifacts. Our mission at RBG is to connect people, plants, and nature, to promote well-being, to promote a life well lived with plants. But we have to do all kinds of things to draw people to the landscape and to interest them. One of the ways we do that in Hendry Park now is with an international sculpture collection, which has been donated by Dan Lowry, a businessman in the city of Burlington. And each year we typically get one or two new sculptural accessions into Hendry Park as part of that international sculpture collection. The best known garden in the area has been the Rose Garden. This certainly was a primary feature of Royal Botanical Gardens when it opened in 1967, and through the subsequent years was considered very important. It had some problems in terms of its management. By the late 1970s, the garden had to be largely restructured with things as prosaic as problems with the irrigation system. These can actually throw the management of an entire garden off. There were also changes to the plant collection itself. And as time went by, the way that the landscape was being managed was changed. So about 12 years ago or so, that central set of rose beds was replaced with a reflecting pool. That allowed us to show other sorts of plants and features within the garden space away from the idea of monoculture roses. By the mid or early to mid 2010s, the rose garden in particular was experiencing more issues, and RBG was challenged by some important things like the development of the ban on the use of cosmetic pesticides in the province. Roses are notorious for requiring chemical life support. And so the decision was taken around 2015 that the rose garden had to have another very serious rejuvenation project. And so the entire design within the arc was changed with the exception of the reflecting pools. What was more important about this, in my view, and in terms of the management of the garden as something with significance as a landscape, is the management change of the rose collection, which went from being largely historical examples to a mixture of roses that are much lighter in requiring life support and also companion plantings. This was designed by Peter Kolkowski, a specialist in roses and sustainable gardening from New York State, who we've worked very closely with. In 2017, the old garden was removed. We had to actually remove the sediment, the soil, right down to sand. This is on a sandy surface because of a disorder that's present in large rose gardens that prohibit the replanting of the same soil with roses after many decades. The new garden was fully planted by mid-2018 and open to the public. Often when a major garden is redeveloped, it's several years before it comes into a really good bloom condition, but this garden was open to the public as soon as the planting was considered finished, and it received a very good set of reviews right away. It's now grown in over the last 3 years, and once people can visit it again, is a highly recommended area, not just for roses, but also, again, for new approaches to sustainable horticulture in a planned setting like this. The dynamics of the garden is well illustrated, I think, by looking at some Google Earth images or satellite images for over the past few years. In 2005, we saw the garden pretty much as it had been for a few decades, but changes started coming in by the end of the 2000s as a decade. Most notably, the addition of a new garden north and a little bit west of the central axis. This is the Helen Kippax garden, which is an ornamental garden, but all of the plants that are used in it are native plants to the province of Ontario. It's not intended as a natural space, but it is a garden of native species. Another big change that's obvious in the south, the big white rectangle is an interior atrium that was added in 2008 with the important feature of providing elevators to let people get down directly to the garden entrance level if they have mobility problems. The earlier design of the garden made no accommodation whatsoever for people with mobility challenges. It's not a great picture. Over time, over the subsequent years, the newly planted gardens, like Kippax Garden, grew in, became part of the landscape and was managed as such. And then there's just a lucky shot from April of 2017, just before that rose garden was renovated, that shows the layout of the monoculture blocks of individual rose cultivars that had been established in this space previously. In October of 2017, we see that rose garden having the soil replaced, the replacement of the walkways, and the new design taking shape. And then in May of 2018, the figure I showed earlier, we see the rose garden completed, and the appearance of the space is pretty much the way it is today. So even though this is a heritage landscape, at least I would argue it is, a big aspect of it is its dynamicism. I can't say that. Its dynamics as a public park, because public horticulture is not static unless it's intended as a historical landscape. And even there, gardens by their nature change. Again, I haven't touched on anything here earlier than the middle 19th century. We have not found any evidence of, for example, indigenous occupation in this area particularly. This area was farmed in the 19th century. It's a nice flat tableland area, probably at one point a prairie habitat. And there certainly could be additional exploration for an earlier human presence on this landscape. But it's not something that we've seen yet. But there certainly are those kinds of traces and associations in the wooded area immediately north and down, especially in the ravine to the north. So I'd like to close with this thought, which I think is so important, that the place has become a shaping partner in our lives. We partly define ourselves in its terms, and it carries the emotional charge of a family member or any other influential human agent. As we think about cultural heritage, as we think about landscape, I think it's critical to keep in mind that the real reason we're interested in this is the connection to other people, whether they're people in the past or whether they're people today. The landscape holds real significant emotional meaning, as well as everything it has to do, everything it can give us as the land that's practical for our own purposes. So thank you very much. I've probably gone a little bit over time, but I appreciate your attention this afternoon.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much, David. I think you have kept us right on time, actually, because we started a few minutes late. We were getting people entered into the webinar. So we're back on schedule, and we wanted to thank you for sharing your experience of managing that very interesting dynamic landscape. I'm a member at the RBG, so I'm very excited to be able to go down on the ground and have a new perspective of that landscape after hearing your talk today. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Kayla. I'm the Heritage Operations Manager at ARA, and I'm co-hosting with Paul. So my role today is to actually introduce our 10-minute break. So there's no need to sign off or exit the webinar. We're going to put up a little logo so everyone can take a break and go and refresh your coffee or check your emails. And we will meet you back here in 10 minutes to start our second session of the day. Thanks so much. So hello, everyone. Welcome back from the break. I hope you have some fresh tea to dive into today's second session. Today's second session is a discussion of the Davisville Cultural Heritage Landscape presented by Dr. Gary Warwick. Gary has over 40 years of archaeological experience in Ontario. He was the regional archaeologist for the Ontario Ministry of Transportation and a full-time professor of Indigenous Studies, History, and Archaeology at Wilfrid Laurier University, where he's now a professor emeritus. More recently, Gary joined ARA as an associate, and we are very proud to have him here. Gary, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, there. So is that working, Kayla?
You are working, Gary.
Okay, perfect. Okay, well, thanks for the introduction. And should I begin now?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Paul did a great job, and David gave an acknowledgement of the land that we are on as well. Being situated here in Brantford, of course, I'm on the land of the Six Nations of the Grand River, Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the lands of the Attawandaron. And the Attawandaron, or the Neutral, are still alive and well, flowing in the veins of members, maybe even of the Mississaugas of the Credit, but certainly the Six Nations of the Grand River. So we think that people have become no more, but they still live on. And certainly the landscapes that were created, there's tiny little pockets still that are left that live on from peoples who occupied this region for the last 13,000 years. So what I'll be talking about today is the cultural landscape of Davisville, which was a community occupied between 1800 and 1830 by the Mohawks, Methodist. It was a Christian Methodist community, and Mississaugas of the Credit for 2 or 3 years. And in the early 2000s, we found archaeological remains that we could match and identify as the community of Davisville. So I'll be using a mixture of history, oral tradition that I've heard from members of both the Mississaugas of the Credit and Six Nations of the Grand River, as well as the archaeology, to fill in the landscape. And I'll also be talking about what happened to that Indigenous landscape, and relatively quickly, it dramatically disappeared. So, let's see. So to begin, I want to throw in a definition of an Indigenous cultural heritage landscape. There are cultural heritage landscapes, and David did a good job of introducing us to those. But I'm using a definition that was published in 2008 by Tom Andrews and Susan Buggy. Susan Buggy was really instrumental in the UNESCO, certainly worked for Parks Canada, but was involved her whole career. She died a few years back, unfortunately, but she was instrumental in defining Indigenous cultural heritage landscapes, along with Tom Andrews. They were working in Northwest Territories with the Dene. And they defined it as Indigenous cultural heritage landscape centers on a people's relationship with the land. That relationship lies in a continuity of association with the land. So relationship continuity, continuity of access to and activities in the land, continuity of oral traditions and practices bound to the land, respect for the knowledge and skills of the elders, and engagement of youth and community, and continuity of memory and identity through intergenerational transfer and continuing practices. So in other words, if there's a resident Indigenous population anywhere in Canada, and certainly in this area there is, right, you're going to have an Indigenous cultural heritage landscape that, because those communities, those people have a continuity going all the way back. Now, we can't know who Paleo-Indian peoples are or Paleo-Americans, right? We don't know who they were. Were they Anishinaabe? Were they Haudenosaunee? Were they a mix? Who knows, right? They were certainly indigenous, right? And so the continuity goes all the way to the present day, and that's the whole point to an indigenous cultural heritage landscape. That relationship and continuity with the land really is embedded in the creation stories, both of the Anishinaabe and of the Haudenosaunee, with a world that was once water and then became land because of this person who fell through the sky world onto the back of a giant turtle, and that became Turtle Island, the land, right? But involved in this, Ernest Smith, he's a Seneca artist from the early 20th century. He's depicting how the animals helped the humans basically create the world, right? And that's really important, that relationship of nature and humans. It's also embedded in treaties that predated Europeans. We know the upper right there, the one of the belts, there's the Confederacy belt, right? The Hiawatha belt, but also there's below it, there's the Turo Wampum, the Gozwenta, which is the relationship between the Dutch and the Mohawk initially, but the Confederacy, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy in 1613, right? And then you have the belt in the lower left that is the dish with one spoon belt. And that belt was struck between the Anishinaabe peoples and the Haudenosaunee peoples and other peoples, basically to share the land, to share the landscape, to share that relationship with the land, right? So again, it's embedded right in their ancient agreements between themselves and other people in this land, right? In other words, to ensure that the land, that relationship that they've had with the land, that their ancestors had with the land, remains. So what we're talking about is the Grand River watershed. Grand River Conservation Authority define it as, the picture on the left here. This is an aerial shot that I took in the early 2000s. I'm not a pilot. I was taken up over the Grand, but you can see that the landscape that you're looking at, that aerial shot, is not the landscape that would have been there for thousands of years, right? That's a very European landscape with the road systems, the lots and concessions, the Cartesian coordinates that have been placed on top and created what we call the modern landscape, right? But that's the physical container that we're talking about, the Grand River watershed. The Haudenosaunee, prior to the Haudenosaunee resettling this area in 1784, the land of the Grand River, and this is an 1821 survey, but the land of the Grand River was occupied by Anishinaabe people, right? Prior to that, it was occupied by neutral Attawandaron, Iroquoian-speaking peoples. Prior to that, we don't know, right? I mean, is it Anishinaabe? Is it Iroquoian? Archaeologists debate that, and even the indigenous nations debate that as well, right? But it's really difficult. It's really difficult to define once you go far, far back in time. Who of modern peoples who really has a single claim to the use of that place or the relationship to that land. It doesn't matter. Norm Jacobs, very quietly at a elder who passed away many years ago, reminded a group of archaeologists and planners with the Red Hill Creek Expressway. It doesn't matter whether they were Haudenosaunee or Anishinaabe. We sure know that they were indigenous, and that's all kind of we need to know, right? For that very ancient times, right? But that relationship is there for that for the Grand River Tract. So 1784, the Mississaugas had given up land to the British. The British gifted this land, gifted in quotes, right? The Haudenosaunee simply regarded it as land that they'd used way back in the time of the neutral, and even during the times of the Mississauga living there as well. It's that dish with one spoon, a shared land. So 1784, 1800 plus, Haudenosaunee, loyal to the British Crown, settled on the lower stretches of the Grand River. And where they settled, this is an example of a site. Just to orient you, the river is flowing down to Lake Erie to the left on the screen, the Grand River. The Bell homestead would be to the upper left of the screen across the river. And we're looking at what's called Eagle's Nest, Eagle's Place. And Eagle Place, there's farm fields right near the Cockshut Bridge that crosses the Grand. And this whole field that you see here in this aerial photo is basically a series of Princess Point villages that stretches about 300 meters along the river's edge here, and overlapped on top of that is a Cayuga settlement dating to the early 19th century. And you can't see anything from this aerial shot. It looks like a cornfield, right, a farm field, but once you get down at ground level, you realize that there's remains of Princess Point. Again, I'm using Emily Dampstra's lovely pictures, and Cayuga settlement. And this is what it looks like to archaeological eyes. Bunch of flags sticking in the ground, marking the locations of artifacts that have been plowed up and put on the surface of the field. So there you have it. That's what represents that village landscape of ancient times, of past times. And we have to, as archaeologists, kind of breathe life back into that distribution of artifacts and say something meaningful about the past. What's really interesting is it's not just at Eagle's Nest, and you can see the sites marked there with the red triangle, right? It's not just Eagle's Nest that's overlapped on top of Princess Point villages or settlements. There's other late 18th, 19th century Haudenosaunee settlements overlapped on top of Princess Point settlement. So when they came in 1784, they used their indigenous eyes and mapped back onto land in a very indigenous way, whether they be Anishinaabe peoples or Haudenosaunee peoples, in a very indigenous way, mapping onto the Grand, right? The way their ancient ancestors mapped onto the Grand. What was a good place to live? Was a good place to live in the 18th, 19th century? Was a good place to live 1,000 years before that, and certainly 3, 4, 5,000 years before that. When they mapped back onto the Grand, they lived in a series of villages governed by what nation they were from, whether they were Seneca, Cayuga, different Cayuga, lower and upper Cayuga. And they lived in small villages of probably about 100, 150 people max, sometimes less than that, according to their nation. And then they carved small fields out of the land around them, on the floodplains mostly. That's where they settled, on the floodplains, which are rich, fertile lands. And their maize fields were carved out, not in a Cartesian way. You can see they're just patchwork quilt here. This is another example. The previous one was Middleport. This is down near Ruthven. You can see the houses of Long Slink and other Delaware people. These are Delaware people living on the banks of the Grand. And then their fields across the way, again, in a patchwork quilt on the floodplain, carved out as small little gardens, 1 to 2 acres per family, probably per household. Davisville, this is the community I was researching in the early 2000s, and it's similar. Lewis Burwell's notes very clearly indicate Indian settlement. You can see that, Indian settlement, and then Indian farms on the opposing side of the river, which is the River Flats. It's a park, campground, Brent Conservation Area, Grand River Conservation Area run it as a campground, right? So, and you can see a house here that used to be the former house of Thomas Davis, the leader of the community, hence it's named Davisville. His property is listed here, indicated here in a map by Augustus Jones. Thomas Davis's cabin is here. And then opposite that, there's a River Flats, cultivated land on the opposite side of the river. So that's Chief Thomas Davis's own property. Archaeologically, this is what we found. The green triangles indicate where we think the remains of Mississauga encampments were. As many as 100 Mississaugas from the Credit lived at Davisville between 1826 to 1828. Or pardon me, 1824 to 1826, and then in 1826 they moved back to the Credit. But the circles represent Mohawk cabins. And you can see very clearly at Davisville that the cabins and the encampments of the Mississaugas and the Mohawks are right together. They're living literally within meters of one another, right? And sharing the land, that sharing the river, sharing the medicinal plants of the wetlands, sharing the deer and the oak savannas nearby, sharing the maple sugar of the woodlots. These arrows here point to, the black arrow on the right points to a Mohawk cabin at Davisville, Davisville 2 we called it. And the red arrow points to a Mississauga encampment that we found. So you can see how close together they are. They're separated by about 60, 70 meters there, right? So very close, within easy hailing distance of one another. And this is Davisville too, just to give you an example of what I just showed you. So the upper right units in the test pits indicate the Mississauga encampment. The squares were the floor of one of the Mohawk cabins at Davisville too, right? So just showing you again how close they are and oriented to the Coldwater Stream. You see the Coldwater Stream exiting into the Grand, very important. There's also a lot of wetlands in the Davisville area too. One thing I want you to remark on is how close to the river's edge. This is the floor of one of the Mohawk cabins. In 10 giant steps, you'd be up to your knees in water, in river water, right? So can you live there today on the Grand? No, you'd be potentially flooded out in spring flood events that happen despite the controls of the Grand River Conservation Authority, happen every spring to varying extents. Sometimes they can be quite damaging still, the floods. So that obviously changed from those early times, right? The kinds of artifacts you find are a mix of European-made ceramics, and then knives, silver, and gun flints, gun parts. Those were given as gifts prior to 1830 to ensure the loyalty as warriors of Indigenous peoples in Ontario. After 1830, there were enough settlers in the area that they could just get militias together or enlist settlers rather than Indigenous people. So they stopped the gifts. So, but those are telltale signs that you're on an Indigenous site when you're getting trade silver, gun flints, and other objects. Davisville was upriver from Mohawk Village, which again was the home of Joseph Brant and once the home of Thomas Davis, who left the Mohawk Village for reasons. Donald Smith, the historian who documented the Mississaugas, and Davisville, for reasons that he was upset with the alcohol consumption and you know, the general not following a Mohawk way, right? So he went upriver with several Mohawk families and established Davisville. This is from Neil Ferris's book, and it indicates different places where cabins were situated, but you can see how close to the river they are, even at Mohawk Village, right? This is from a Lewis Burwell 1839 map, and you can see Mohawk Village, Indian farms with the red circle around it, and a Cayuga village, and the large area on the oxbow of the Grand River at Brantford, right? You can see Indian farms, and those farms, again, similar to at Middleport, at Ruthven, at Davisville, the farms seem to be across the river on the flats, right? So they're living on one side of the river, taking a canoe across to hoe their gardens and their fields. Eventually they became plow agriculturalists, right? But initially it was just same way that their ancestors had farmed, using hoes, planting maize, beans, and squash, grafting potato on. Potato became popular as a starchy crop. They also had small gardens probably near their houses, especially for growing things like tobacco, small little plots for growing tobacco near their houses, little gardens, right? But so you have a series of villages with farms on the river flats, usually across the river. That's just in the lower Grand. That seems to be the way they set up their settlement system, but with their houses on the east bank or the north bank of the Grand, and their farms on the south or west bank. One thing that, so that's a basic settled landscape that's available to us archaeologically. Things that aren't so visible, but we know existed, are things like white oak savanna and prairie. Now, If you take a look at this map here, and this is a picture of what oak savanna looks like, right? So it looks very meadow-like in between large oak trees, right? And the Europeans remarked on this and said that, you know, they would be going through an area on their way in Ontario, on their way west down toward Detroit, and they would be passing through large expanses of looked like parkland to them, oak parkland they described it as, because that was what they were familiar with as Europeans, right? We know now, though, there's been extensive studies done by foresters and archaeologists, primarily in the United States, New York State, and further south, not very much done in Ontario, surprisingly, in terms of looking at oak savanna and the relationship between oak savanna and indigenous settlements, right? But we know that these are thousands of years old from pollen records in Ontario. And if you read the literature closely, oak savannas have to be maintained by frequent fire. Now, frequent fires are fires that are every few years. You don't get lightning strike fires in a deciduous Carolinian forest that would cause that kind of burning, right? So frequent fires, they're maintained by human burning, human fire, anthropogenic fires, right? So that would have been a huge landscape. And this map is taken from people who are interested in oak prairie and oak savanna, and I can't remember the name of the exact organization. I should have had it up here on the map to credit them. But the green areas are areas that were recorded as oak savanna in the early 19th century. The red areas are the remnants that are left. So you can see that it's a remnant landscape. And even the areas of the 19th century, that would have been the remnants of a much larger, I submit, oak savanna from earlier times that would have been prime hunting territory for deer. They have to be burned. This is an example of oak savanna being burned, the grasses. The oak trees are really hardy. And this is my sketch overlaid on top of a 19th century historical plan of Brant County with the yellow dots indicating the Haudenosaunee settlements from the 19th century. And you can see the proximity of the large tracts of oak savanna to the Grand River, to the lower Grand, right, in Brant County, and those settlements, right? So they're right there. They're prime deer hunting territories. And so ideal. And in previous times, the acorns would have been harvested as well as the deer in those areas, right? So oak savanna is a real prominent part of the landscape that has now disappeared. It's farmland. It's been chopped down and cleared for farmland or urbanized. It's under the city. So we don't see that anymore, but it would have been there as part of their cultural landscape. Very much so. In fact, William Pope, the naturalist, on his way to London from in between Brant County and London, described oak savanna as timber scattered in single trees and small patches and mostly oak. Indians were formerly accustomed to set fire to the brushwood in order to clear the land that grass might more freely grow, which furnished plenty of food for deer. Thus, these animals were enticed from all the surrounding forest. So he's giving you a reason why it was maintained and how it was maintained. So you're looking at a landscape that goes well beyond the gardens, well beyond the settlements, but it's still a maintained landscape. And for a purpose, right? That relationship with the deer, with the oak trees, with the land, right? To maintain it. And as I said, I'm submitting to you that it's thousands of years old, that relationship with burning to maintain oak savanna. Some foresters and archaeologists would disagree with what I just told you. The literature is extensive. I invite you to, to browse it yourself. If you're interested, you can email me later. I can give you some starter papers for references that will start you off in that literature, but it's something that hasn't really been dealt with in a big way in Ontario, in Southern Ontario. Another part of the landscape that's very important to Davisville residents, as well as all the other Indigenous peoples at that time and previous to that time, was a really interesting MA thesis by Eric Tincombe, McMaster University, and I was served on his committee. So that's how I know about it, right? He just recently defended in the fall of 2020. He looked at late archaic settlements in the lower Grand River and their relationship to deer yarding areas, but as well as fish spawning areas, especially walleye spawning areas. And these areas here coincide very clearly with your huge concentrations of late archaic sites, right? So again, these areas are prime, you know, the area in the middle there that's in blue, that large walleye spawning area, it's thousands of years old. If late archaic people were there harvesting the fish, which he thinks they were, they don't have a lot of evidence, of course, because there's no preservation of the fish bony remains from late archaic sites, but there's a relationship there, an association between clusters of late archaic sites and the river with those spawning beds for walleye, right? So that's in the Cayuga area, and it's the Princess Point. People settled there for the floodplains and the fish. And in the 18th, 19th century, the Haudenosaunee and the Mississaugas would have used that area as well, right? So there's a persistence in terms of the land, what it can provide, and that's indigenous knowledge that goes back thousands of years. They would know that. They would know those locations, and that's why we see overlapped occupations again and again and again in certain areas of the Grand River and not in others so much, right? So you've got, you know, weirs being erected at, presumably those weirs are gone, right? But fishing certainly was for sturgeon, you know, sturgeon dams that went in the early 19th century. Unfortunately, sturgeon can't swim up from Lake Erie to spawn in the Grand River anymore. So the last time we see sturgeon in archaeological sites is in the 1840s on indigenous sites, and then it disappears, it's gone. That's because the fish were gone, right? Because things changed, right? But the river was very productive. Peter Jones talks in his diary, his autobiography in the 1820s, of going jacklight fishing with some of his relatives, Mississaugas, at Davisville, and catching 120 fish in one night, right? So very productive. This is a picture of from the early 20th century of spearfishing along the banks of the Grand. We also found lots of net sinkers in Davisville. Now, some of these can be attributed probably to earlier occupations at the cabin sites, because we did have evidence of ancient remains there, but I think that the net sinkers were being used by the residents at Davisville. They're casting nets. Maple sugar camps. Maple sugar camps are another feature of the indigenous cultural landscape in this area. And we know they would have been out there and used. And even Lewis Burwell in his survey notes talks about encountering maple sugar camps when he's surveying the land in the 1820s, 1830s. And they're difficult to find. Recently, there was an article that was published, and I can't remember what journal it was in, from either Michigan or Wisconsin, of finding 19th century indigenous maple sugar camps. But they're really difficult to find because they're very ephemeral, right? They don't leave very much. As Paul Rachel remarked in his opening remarks, that whole idea of living lightly on the land. For an archaeologist, it's really difficult for us to find some of these features of a cultural landscape that is no longer. Trails as well. This is from an 1815 map, and it's upside down, so you have to turn it around, but you can see very prominently right in the middle from 1815, there's a Mississauga village on the Grand River, right? So when they, quotes, gave up the land to the British, in their eyes, they didn't give up the land at all. They continued to live on the Grand River, in and amongst the Onondaga and the Delaware on this particular map, right? So there they are, very clearly portrayed there on this map. But you can see an Indian path, it's called, Indian trail that crosses the river and continues on. Some of these became roads and others are now obliterated and under farmers' fields, right? So this is what was imposed in the 1830s, a little bit earlier than that too, but a grid pattern by land surveyors was posed in the Brant County area. And this was the landscape that we see now. Everyone thinks of this as an idyllic country landscape, but everything you see in this picture is of European design, the way the lots and roads are laid out, the Cartesian system, the vegetation, a lot of the trees and the vegetation, the crops and everything else, the weeds that you see in here from Europe. It's not an indigenous cultural landscape at all. It's been dramatically changed and altered, and all that we see as archaeologists are the remains of that, of settlements and the use of the land, that relationship to the land in the archaeological remains. Lands, of course, were whittled down to nothing, right? So the original 1,000,000 acres of the Haldeman tract is now barely, 4 48,000 acres of the Six Nations of the Grand River, along with the Mississaugas of the Credit, who moved there in 1847 because their lands were taken up on the Credit by settlers and not protected, right? So you have a huge loss of land and out of the control of people. You also have a change in the pattern of occupation, a use of the land, a relationship, which was it was forced upon people like the Mississauga, the Anishinaabe peoples, because they could no longer hunt, gather, collect, garden the way that their ancestors did for thousands of years. They had to live the way that settlers were living. And this is the lower picture is Peter Jones' wife, Eliza, did this little watercolor charcoal sketch, I guess it is, of the Mississauga cabins, which is now a golf course on the Credit River. But this upper left one, I show this as an example. It's a Paul Kane picture, actually, from the 1840s north of Lake Huron, but showing you how people, the Mississauga would have looked living at Davisville, right? So in 1 year, they went from 1826 Davisville to a year later living like settlers, right? With fences and fields and, you know, the whole works, right? Partly this was justified by lies that were sent back to London by administrators, like Lieutenant Governor Peregrine Maitland. Here's what he had to say in 1821. It is proposed that the reserve appropriated to that portion of the Mohawks, which is settled on the Grand River and which is no longer useful as a hunting ground, being surrounded by settlements, meaning settler settlements, be vested in a board of trustees to be disposed of by sale or lease for the benefit of Six Nations. This is a lie. And why I know this is a lie, because at Davisville, which was occupied in 1821, just upriver from Mohawk Village, and certainly even the early cabin at Mohawk Village that Neil Ferris reported on in Ian Kenyon, a large portion of the animal bones are wild game, especially deer. So hunting was a big, important part of life on the Grand River to the Indigenous people who lived there, right? And so this is a lie, and it's to justify basically opening a land up to settlers. Well, eventually they did get their way. In 1841, there was a purported surrender, and I'm using purported. Susan Hill and Rick Montour and others, scholars from Six Nations, use that term because it was signed only by 7 Confederacy chiefs. And later, a number of them said that they didn't really agree with it. They were forced to sign anyway. But by 1848, basically most of the Haldeman Tract had been cleared of Indigenous settlement and basically concentrated on the present day reserve that exists now. This is a great term by Sarah Hunt. She's Kwakwakiu from the Northwest Coast. And in her PhD, she coined this term colonialscapes. And she calls them colonialscapes, might be understood as representations of the space now called Canada, which perpetuate and manifest particular colonial expressions of power. Colonialscapes thus cover over other spatial relations and representations as the colonial view blankets over these prior and deeper spatial orders. That's exactly what's going on with the Indigenous cultural landscape in Brant County. So you have this that was plopped right on top of all of those other things I was describing, the cabins, the gardens, the medicinal plant gathering areas, the oak savannas, all of that was plopped down on top, and that cultural landscape, really Indigenous cultural landscape, erased and replaced with this, right? We see it in the actual sediments. This is a Davisville 3, which was a Mississauga encampment. This is a soil profile, and the dashed line, above that dashed line, is all modern deposits, post 1830. The artifacts that we were getting that dated to the occupation of the Mississaugas in 1824 to 26 are below that dashed line. So everything above there is flood deposits. So it's showing you that it's like a geological event that altered the landscape and altered the way Indigenous people could relate to the river, relate to the land. It changed it forever. This is from Brant County Historical Atlas. This is Six Nations. And you can see they're no longer oriented toward the river, and their cabins are situated quite a ways back of the river. If anything, you have a little road that goes along the river, but most of them are on inland lots and concessions, the way Europeans would live, not oriented at all to the way they're recently that they had been living in the earlier 19th century. So again, from Sarah Hunt's work, although the land was imagined as empty and made to be legally empty, we know through Indigenous people's lived experiences, oral histories, and legal relations that the land was not empty. It was indeed rich with life, life that goes back to time immemorial, not back to the date of Canada's formation as a state. And we know that as archaeologists, we find that evidence. So it's up to us. We have the responsibility to Indigenous nations, Indigenous peoples. They already know that history. They know that history. They might not know, you know, the particulars of what happened 6,000 years ago the way an archaeologist might, but we have a responsibility, I think, to tell settler Canada that, you know, that there were these past cultural landscapes there that are out there on the land still. There's still evidence of them, right? And that's important, and that links up to Tom Andrews and Susan Buggy's definition of a cultural landscape. You can see it from space. This is the Google Earth image of Six Nations of the Grand River. You can see it. There it is very clearly. And I kind of pilfered this idea from Norm Jacobs, who used to give talks to my university students in the early 2000s, and Paul General as well, who would show this image. And to say this is a different place, a different way of relating to the land, and it's still preserved there in that tiny little postage stamp called Six Nations Reserve, along with the Mississaugas of the Credit. How do we tell that? Well, we tell that story through what we're finding archaeologically and getting it out to a general public. We're not very good at that as archaeologists, but certainly the information could be used by Indigenous nations as well. But Carolyn King, you know, who is attending this conference today, the symposium, right? She's single-handedly, and Paul's mentioned at the beginning too, but I wanted to do a call out to Carolyn, and, you know, like, she's trying to do her part to say to Canada, to the settler Canada, to say, hey, once upon a time, not too long ago, this was an Indigenous cultural landscape, and it still is. It still is an Indigenous cultural landscape. And just to end here, this is the last slide, and I'm sorry I've gone over a little bit. Paul General told me this story many years ago of getting phoned up by an irate farmer in the fall. And there were some Six Nations hunters hunting deer on the back of his farm, in the back 40 of his farm. And they hadn't received permission. They didn't knock on his door, which they probably should have. But you know, this farmer was just, you know, fit to be tied, and he was reaming Paul out, Paul General, right, at his office, and he just politely, in a very Paul General way, very calmly, politely said to him, well, sir, you know, actually the Six Nations men aren't hunting on your farm. Your farm is on their hunting territory. And it's a way to remind. It was of course, the phone, you know, just clattered down and, you know, in Paul's ear, right? You know, the farmer wouldn't have any of that, but it was his gentle way of reminding all of us that, you know, once upon a time, this was hunting territory, and it still is today. It still is an Indigenous cultural heritage landscape. But the important part is it has to be available to be used, right? Now, how do you do that? Can you rewild all of Southern Ontario and make those oak savannas come back again? You can't, right? But, you know, you have to do your small part to remind people, and perhaps to try to recreate small patches of oak savanna somewhere, just as a reminder of what once was here. But certainly from an Indigenous perspective, you know, their Indigenous cultural landscapes are using the land, gathering medicinal plants, going deer hunting, fishing on the Grand River, doing maple sugaring, all of those activities that connected them to the land in that relationship that is, like I say, thousands of years old in the Grand River. So I'm going to end there.
Well, thank you very much, Gary. That was really interesting, and I loved the images and the maps that you showed, a lot of ones that I hadn't seen before, so that was really awesome. We do have 2 questions that came in, so we have a few minutes on our schedule, so I can ask them to you if that works. Mm-hmm. So the first question is, I think it's Jeff. It said, a big issue right now in the GTA is the GTA West Highway. Is cultural heritage a major issue? I'm not hearing this being raised by the opposition as a concern.
In the GTA West Highway. Oh, is that the one that's?
So I did a little Google because I wasn't sure what it was either. And it looks like it's a new proposed highway running through York, Peel, and Halton region.
Okay, I'm not familiar with that at all, Kayla, that highway. Once upon a time I would have been, because I worked for the transportation for 10 years.
So maybe you can provide some insight into maybe the typical process that heritage would be considered under.
Yeah, okay, so just in general, yeah, there's laws in Ontario that require an archaeological assessment of any property that would be affected by that new road, that new highway. So, and even lands beyond the right of way too. That's now standard, because those could be staging areas for construction machinery, or just impacted in general beyond the dashed lines that will be the new highway, right? So that's been standard for many years, right? So so archaeology is part of that, but what isn't really a big part of that whole thing is sitting down with Indigenous nations, Indigenous elders and people, and really saying, okay, what's the oral history like for this area? What, do you have concerns that way in terms of cultural land use and heritage, the cultural landscapes? They're difficult to deal with, right? Because once you've defined an area as having a Indigenous cultural heritage landscape, basically what I was trying to say today was all of Brant County was the whole lower Grand River, beyond 6 miles either side too. It wasn't just confined to. So how do you plan a highway that isn't going to disrupt an Indigenous cultural heritage landscape? You can't really, right? You can minimize the impact of such a highway on that. But yeah, so basically what you can see is the archaeological remains of the past relationship and land use, right? And that's what we do as archaeologists. But often what gets disregarded is the not the present day use, because that's should be part of the whole consultative process with First Nations, with Indigenous nations, right? In terms of any land development impact to the land. But certainly the archaeology is a very visible way and a very clear way. If we go out as archaeologists and we don't find anything, then it almost says, okay, it wasn't used in the past then, was it? And it's like, no, I'm not saying that. It could have been used in the past. We just didn't find any remains. Like it could have had maple sugaring camps on it. We're not going to find those. If it was a maple sugar camp from 1820s, you're not going to find that with traditional archaeological survey techniques. You're just not. You're not going to see it in a plowed field. Right? It doesn't mean it wasn't there, right? So that's up to an Indigenous nation to say, we were told, right, by the elders that area, when it was a forest, not a plowed field, was a prime maple sugaring area, right? That's the kind of information that needs to be, we need that more, is what I'm saying. And it's not near there, not in Southern Ontario. More in the West it is, and in the North, that kind of information is very helpful and important, but less so in Southern Ontario. We rely on the old, well, if you can't see it, you can't taste it, you can't feel it, it wasn't there, right? And it's kind of sad, that we're not putting more of that oral history, that oral tradition in there from Indigenous nations, right? To fill out the complete picture. Because what I gave you was predominantly from history and archaeology, right? Less so little snippets of oral tradition in there that I've been told, but very little actually. And we need more of that.
That we had a question come in while you were talking, so kind of leads into this. And then we can go back to, there was one more question unrelated. It says there's a duty to consult Indigenous people in the provincial policy statement, but is the nature of the consultation spelled out anywhere, i.e. about Indigenous cultural heritage landscapes?
Cultural heritage landscapes are part of that, right? But yeah, it's not spelled out really clearly. And the whole thing with consultation, that this is just me personally, right? I mean, you know, that whole United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples very clearly says, you know, with traditional territories and land that is being used by Indigenous nations, right, they should have the ability to be consulted and give free, prior, and informed consent to that development. What does that mean? Well, to me, if I were to say to you, Kayla, you know, I'm going to take a blood sample from you, but I need your free, prior, and informed consent. What if you don't give it? Can I just go ahead and do it anyway? No, no. So free, prior, and informed consent when it comes to land development, right, in the state of Canada, with regards to Indigenous nations, yeah, consultation means, yeah, we sit down and we talk about it. And if they have a huge concern, right, then maybe we change our plans, maybe, right? But it's free, prior, and informed consent, the way it's being used in this country, it's a joke, really. It's not living up to the spirit at all of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And any Indigenous person in Canada would tell you that, right? But you know, it's kind of sad. It really is kind of sad that's not part of our planning process, right? The Indigenous nations should, for certain developments in certain areas, I'm not saying all, and they're pragmatic people as well, right? They're not going to put a halt to all development everywhere in Canada. They're not, right? But they want to be part of it right from the get-go. And that's what's not being done, generally speaking, in development in Southern Ontario, right? It's sometimes archaeology gets missed, and archaeology is right up there on the list of things that you have to do, right? In certain places, sometimes archaeology is not even considered, right? So Indigenous, yeah, cultural heritage landscapes, sadly, they're you know, there should be a big map. We should be developing big maps, right, of Indigenous cultural heritage landscape areas, right? But that, as I said, that would scare the heck out of any government and any municipality and any set of developers, right? If they started to have to mind, you know, the way we do with natural areas, right? They do it with natural areas. Why does natural areas get precedence over an area that's sacred and important to Indigenous nations? I don't know.
Okay, it's just one more question that came in while you were talking during your presentation. Do you have any information on why did the flooding increase along the Grand River? Is it because there's fewer trees?
Yes, that is the reason. So yeah, further upriver, you know, Kitchener-Waterloo area, for example, right? Paris, you know, Cambridge, right? Those areas, you know, they're being settled by the 1830s. The first devastating flood recorded for the Brantford area that flooded large areas of what is now downtown Brantford, where people had to walk on top of the fence posts, you know, that their whole fields were flooded, entire fields flooded, you know, way beyond the river. It was 1833. And that's where we see the evidence at Davisville disappear. We don't have any artifacts post-dating 1830 at Davisville. And I'm convinced that flood would have literally carried away the houses, the log cabins off their moorings and floated them down the stream, you know, down the river. I'm convinced that's how bad the flood was. So prior to that time, you don't really see any evidence of the flooding, because what we see is the houses were right there, right on the banks of the Grand. And the Grand River hasn't changed in 10,000 years. We know that from geological work that's been done, coring and stuff, right? The central channel of the Grand has remained constant for 10,000 years, right? So, and settlement is right there on the banks of the river for 10,000 years, but it all changes after the 1830, right? That changes completely. So yeah, it's basically the forest was chopped down and no longer could be a sponge holding all that winter melt, you know, the water from the winter, the snowpack melting, and it just all at once went into the ground and flooded.
Well, thank you very much, Gary, for your presentation and your answers. We had a few other ones come in, but it's time for us to wrap up. So
Okay.
we maybe will touch base with you offline and get those answers to provide to the participants that have asked us. So we wanted to thank everybody for attending today, and we're so grateful that it doesn't seem like there was any technical difficulties today, so yay. Tomorrow's sessions are starting at 9:30. So we'll again have 2 sessions in tomorrow morning. We wanted to split up the day because sitting on Zoom all day is a hard. So we'll be doing 2 sessions tomorrow morning beginning at 9:30 a.m. So we hope to see you all back here using the reminder link and joining us back here to continue the conversation about cultural heritage landscapes. Thanks again, everyone. See you tomorrow.